Hello, Network, and welcome to this edition of Look, Lead, Learn, the series where we'll be exploring the ways in which business leaders have navigated change to ultimately learn, adapt, and grow through what has been a very uncertain last few years for us all. My name's Lewis Morgan from Cedus. Today I'm joined by David Brear, CEO and co-founder of 11FS, a company who, like us, work with some of the biggest banks in the world and whose key focus is bringing the financial services sector into the next generation by building and launching next generation digital propositions. David, would you like to introduce yourself and tell us a little bit about 11FS and what it is you do?
I think you smashed that. I think that was a great introduction. So, hi everybody. My name is David Brear. As Lewis said, I'm the CEO here at 11FS. Had a bit of a weird career in various different guises, which I'm sure we'll sort of get into in a second. But as Lewis sort of described, really the key thesis for 11FS right now is, or our vision as a business is to change the fabric of financial services. We firmly believe that actually digital is change really what it means to be a financial services organization in 2022 and beyond, and because of that they need to adapt to the environment. It's the story as old as time with regards to sort of evolution versus revolution in that sense. And depending on which part of the organization or what part of the financial services industry you actually operate in, you'll have a very different view of whether it is indeed revolution or evolution that is really required. But we've had a lot of fun over the last 6 years figuring that out.
Wonderful. Yeah, it's never easy in this sort of sector, but we figure it out and we make change happen. So if we jump straight into it, then obviously we know the last few years have been fraught with change, and the financial services sector hasn't been sheltered from that by any means. Of course, we had the pandemic, seismic shift towards remote working. Started, particularly in financial services, we had to experience market volatility and issues with cross-border trade that we're experiencing right now in some parts of Europe. So, what specific challenges has this brought to your door at 11FS? But also, as I know you describe yourself as a bit of a fintech nerd, and you seem to have your finger on the pulse firmly when it comes to a lot of the key issues surrounding this. What impact have you also seen it's had on the wider industry as a whole?
Yeah, I mean, one issue then the other, and the first issue really was, man, it was just a weird period, really. February 2020 until really recently, actually, most organizations just kind of went into like stasis, really. They, as you do, I mean, when your fight or flight sort of kicks in, you sort of deprioritize all of the things that actually are important against all of the things that are really truly urgent. And actually, I think global financial services organizations really went into what is most urgent and how do we solve those urgencies. Customers' lives have fundamentally changed. Branch networks can't operate. Remote working needs to be a thing. And actually, overnight, really, we saw organizations really prioritize all of those urgencies across the organization, and surprisingly, come through many of them very much unscathed in that sense, which is quite amazing, really, given the inertia that we've seen in many of those topics for well over a decade. I'd say the knock-on effect of that from our perspective was, I mean, people started or stopped doing the fun things for a little while. They stopped doing things that really challenged themselves or changed themselves, and that's hard. But the swing of that really, and really I'd say what is our major challenge right now, 11FS's biggest challenge is hiring. And the reason for that is because of everybody is singing our tune right now. Digital isn't a channel, it's the way in which the business operates completely. Whether it's touching how your HR systems work or how you're really truly embracing dissemination of decision making to the edges of an organization to truly embody agile. And all of those things require different ways of working, different ways of thinking, and different levels of aspirations of actually what it is that you fundamentally deliver to your customers. So from our perspective, it's when you're a small business in the way that we are, we're 6 years old, we're a couple of hundred people, actually being in a situation where we can land planes as good as you like, as good as anybody in the industry, but landing all of them at the same time is sort of an air traffic control version of work that we've never really had to deal with in all honesty, to now, because the change adoption curve for digital is slow. The early adopters do their thing, and slowly you get that move. But we are well and truly into the majority of people realizing now that the emperor's new clothes for a decade is not really got them to the investment, returning what they wanted it to do. And thankfully, the definition of madness is always kind of portrayed as, doing the same thing over and over and again and expecting a different outcome. Thankfully, people are now changing what they're doing in order to try and achieve an even higher level of aspiration. So, yeah, it's fun times to be us. But actually, it's, that's by design. We're an organization that very much leads by saying what we think, and really portraying and disseminating the beliefs that we have as an organization. And that works really effectively when you're trying to align a community around a vision that actually no one organization can deliver on its own. So, the more people who are mobilized towards changing the fabric of financial services, the better from our perspective.
Brilliant. Yeah, I mean, you reeled off a few challenges there that I think are not just exclusive to you guys, right? Like there's been a terrible problem with hiring across the board, especially in technology, right? Especially with the rise of remote working. I mean, for instance, we've been going a similar sort of time to you guys, about 7 years, and we've been fully remote that entire time. Right, so we almost lost a shed of our USP over the pandemic when it comes to hiring and the pool of people we had access to. So, I mean, from your side, along with the problems of landing all the planes at once and trying to get this key message across, has the sort of impacts of the last couple of years affected your strategy when executing that, or have you stayed really, really tight and true to that vision?
I'd say, I mean, the interesting thing on that, I mean, 11FS isn't really a single business, really, and then actually from the beginning, 11FS hasn't really been a single business. So the impact of the pandemic has actually been different to different business areas. We are a consultancy business. Our ventures business have built new banks around the world. We're a research business. We help people understand the market and the customers. And these things, that hasn't really changed. If anything, it's dialed up the urgency for them. When it comes to our product sides of our business, then actually, the benchmarking product is more relevant than ever. And actually, when you look at something like the core systems, the Foundry platform that we're building out, actually the sort of almost the inevitability now of that type of product being needed in the market with regards to the transformations that are really needed to be seen in that deep-seated sort of technological sense, or even down to it's Conway's law, isn't it, that sort of says you are just the manifestations of the technologies and the operations that you've got in place. And actually banks have been lumbering, slow moving, high fat when it comes to the costs for 100 years. Now that they're trying to change those things, they've got to try and change all of those technological pieces as well. So, we've got 5 or 6, if you count the media business as well, which it's odd for a business to have a marketing department that's a profit center for the company. It's quite bizarre in the makeup of what we do. But, having that, all of them at different levels of maturity, I'd say it's impacted them both positively and negatively very, very differently. All of it really, though, I mean, similarly to you, Lewis, I mean, we started the business 6 years ago completely remotely. I live in Norwich, Ross was up in Edinburgh, Jason was in Leicester, so actually the distributed workforce, in fact, actually very often the work that we've built banks in Hong Kong and Singapore and Dubai and the US. I mean, our teams are always remote from that. We don't send 30 people to Midwestern America to go and do a thing. We build great relationships. That means it doesn't really matter where you are, and that extends to, from our perspective, it doesn't really matter where you are. I don't care if you're at home or in a Starbucks or whatever. It's like, actually, it's not where you are, it's what you do that matters, right? So, but that always comes down to the mentality, I think, of the teams, the structures, and the accountability that I think you have to bring to the culture of a company in terms of what those things are. There's a handful of people in the business that I very rarely see, but I trust them explicitly in terms of wherever they are. I know they're doing absolutely the best thing in the world that they can do to achieve the things that they need to achieve. So I think it comes down to the muscle memory and the mentality, the culture of that company, whether those things are really problems or whether they're really opportunities. Don't get me wrong. I think remote working works. I think for existing relationships, it works incredibly well. It's just not as fun. Like, and actually, the just not fun bit, well, you've got to kind of figure out ways of capitalizing on creating moments of fun, or creating sort of serendipity of connectivity, or getting everybody together for a I don't know, a booze up and go out go karting or whatever. Probably not in that order. I'll be honest with you in terms of those two things. I wouldn't. I'm not a big advocate of drinking and driving, but just how do you help reconnect people in a period of time where actually they've spent so much time, really focused on the business, and that's great. But you go to work for much more than just getting paid and doing your job. It's everything around that really makes it fun.
Yeah, absolutely. I couldn't have said it better. I think, especially when you're in a kind of growth startup with big ambitions in the sectors that you operate in, and very much that we do as well. I mean, we know from research that culture encourages high performance, right? And it's without having that culture and that shared vision, it's hard to get that out of people. I think when people are incentivized by more than just perks and cash in the bank, and they can buy into the wider vision of a business, they get a lot more out of it, and we as business leaders get a lot more out of it as well. It's just how do we?
Yeah, it's purpose. I think that's the word, and I think whenever I also with culture, I think the word that's missing is performance, because what you're trying to drive when people talk about culture, it becomes a very sort of ethereal, football tables and like free lunches and stuff, whereas actually like the thing that you're trying to drive is the performance that you need. Our vision is about changing the fabric of financial services, but our mission as a business is just about unleashing potential. So actually, if we unleash, and that's not the potential of our clients at all, that's the potential of our people. Because actually, 11FS's successes is just the summation of the successes that everybody in the business has on a day-to-day basis. If we put in place the rituals and the rhythms and the processes to encourage people to do the best work that they've ever done, or just at a minimum, I mean, the amount of corporate organizations I've worked either in or with, where the thing that is most important from a strategy perspective and the things that are in people's diary are completely separate. In terms of, we believe this thing is important. Great. When should we meet to do something about it? How's 3 months from Wednesday? And it's like, look, if this is important to you, this should be happening tomorrow. Like, if you haven't thought about how you're going to be doing it when you're leaving the meeting, then this isn't actually really that important to you. So and we've tested that a few times with clients. To be honest with you, there was a big bank in the UK which was like, yeah, this is a strategic imperative. Can we talk in September? And it was like March, and it's like, I think you're using the word strategy or strategically important in a very different way that we interpret it. So, but I do think that word purpose is so critical. Like, fundamentally, I think money is hygiene. I think many of the things that people think are differentiators in their workplace are just levels of expectations these days in terms of what it is. But actually, I think the purpose, that deeper meaning of why you should care about the company being successful. Well, if you can align that Venn diagram of the things that the business wants to do and the things that an individual will gain meaning from, will deliver on their purpose, then people perform at a higher level than even they would think that they would be able to do. And it's not, and my focus always on culture, values, and purpose is not a idealistic or some sort of ideology of hugs in the morning and everybody being permanently happy type thing. It's more that actually, if everybody really wants to perform at the highest level, you need the environment, the variables to be right to make that happen. Which for me goes back much more to my sporting days than it does my business days, because you wouldn't expect a marathon runner to run amazing times on an empty stomach. You wouldn't expect a boxer to turn up and not have got his mind right as much as he's got his biceps right. And actually, if you think about it, it just makes sense, doesn't it? But playing that out in the reality of a business world, when you're deeply fixated with your P&L, or this client thing, or losing this thing, or this person's quit, or whatever, like actually, in that context of it, your values, your purpose, your meaning are often the first thing to be thrown over the side when you're trying to sort of reduce drag. But for me, it will be the thing that I go down with the ship with, because if we lose ourselves, we lose everything, quite frankly.
Yeah, I think there is this kind of pattern that everybody seems to have principles, and until they're tested, and then they all go out the window very often. I think it all goes back to
Definitely.
what you said at the beginning around companies valuing urgency over efficiency or optimization, right? So when we talk about these strategic imperatives not being as important as they perhaps first seem in the meeting, right? They get pushed back months and
Yeah.
months. I think, especially larger organizations and especially banks and big financial services, they often get caught in this cycle of firefighting or rushing to firm delivery dates and not having that time to step back and really look at the bigger picture about how do we achieve what we're trying to achieve better.
Yeah, I think particularly when it's hard. Like, I mean, and again, look, I've got a having been in a big bank for 6 years. Like, these people are not stupid. You know what I mean? Like, there's no like lack of understanding or desire to make these changes happening. But it's really difficult, particularly when you're facing into a competitive landscape that's more competitive than ever before. That, small organizations are nipping in and taking, swathes of customers and revenue with that, leaving huge amounts of operational cost for big organizations to deal with. But I think it's like, almost, I think many organizations have been paralyzed by a fear of moving in that sense, you know. And actually, when it comes to the bits that look innovative, then they're sort of innovative around the edges. They're predominantly around presentation. They're not really touching into the major problems of business models and, transformations of ways of working, um, because big organizations are used to big transformations, and more painfully than that, they're used to big transformations not really transforming anything. I wrote about it a couple of weeks ago, but I had a non-executive director at a big bank in the UK say, the problem with us is we keep going into a chrysalis from being a caterpillar and coming out a caterpillar again, forgetting that we wanted to be a butterfly. And it's like, you see that pattern being replicated in many big organizations. And look, this isn't just a financial services problem. This is like big company issue more broadly, which is the way you've become successful is really, really difficult to let go of, particularly if you need to change it or augment your business model or your fundamental offering to customers. If you look at the car manufacturing right now, I mean, every car manufacturer is having like an existential crisis because, like, well, we build combustion engines, you know what I mean? And it's like, this electric car thing means like all these engineers, like, we don't need those guys. Like, we need like the electric guys, like, so. And it's and actually, I mean, it's why we're starting to see more and more electric cars from traditional manufacturers be just bizarrely overly complicated in everything that they do. It's the form factor they're used to rather than the form factor that the industry needs or the consumers need. Very often, I think it's where somebody like Tesla's been amazingly successful, is that first principle thinking around, well, what is transportation, or what is really needed in these things, gets you to a very, very different outcome. And very often that's what we work with our clients with. As an example, something like Mox in Hong Kong, working with Standard Chartered to build, not only in one of their biggest territories, but right under the nose of their biggest competitor, what is now the biggest downloaded app in Hong Kong. Was a really interesting challenge. But so much of that was in very similar way that it was with Alison Rose when we were building out Metal in West. It's letting go of those things that for certain, because actually they're no longer relevant to the market. The customer problems, the change in the market, technological advancements. These things mean the things that we think we know, we probably don't know anymore.
That's absolutely right. And I read your latest double click newsletter around some of the points you touch on there with regards to innovation. And I think,
I mean, it's been an interesting one on the DMs today. I have to say, the amount of innovation managers that have got in touch wanting that virtual hug on that one, because it's a real problem. It really is. Like, the the word innovation is so bastardized that I'm not sure people really understand what it means. And it really means something very different to every layer within that organization. So actually, first and foremost, being clear about what do we mean, and therefore getting clear about how do we measure it, just seems like a great starting point for having a much better, much more fruitful conversation. Because if we don't do that, we just leave the sort of areas of disappointment open, don't we?
Absolutely. I think sort of that shared sentiment and shared definitions of words is actually much more important than a lot of organisations realise. If we say innovation, what do we mean? How do we qualify it? How do we define it? And ultimately, how do we measure it? I mean, you use the Apple story as a bit of a case study with the iPods, and how the essence of innovation is not only disrupting the market, but also disrupting your own previous business model in a way, right? So it's being able to let go of what's perhaps been successful in the past to truly blaze that trail rather than just trying to imitate what somebody else has done that's been slightly successful.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, I got picked up on that this morning actually on a speaking thing that I did off the back of that, and actually I think it's when you look at uh, the rationale for Apple's kind of you know ending of that series, ending of that iPod series after 20 years, of just wild success in that sense. It's like, well, actually, the customers' needs have changed, therefore the things that we deliver has changed. And I think that's the difficulty when you sort of stand back from financial services, like the financial instruments that have been, distributed through people and telephony and now websites and mobile apps. It's just the same stuff, like, and actually you cannot for 1 second think that, post pandemic, post Brexit, cost income, issues, the challenges of cost of living and everything that's happening. You can't for 1 second think that actually we can still fall back on the same products and services that were invented 250, 300 years ago. It is just illogical. There's no other industry where that would be the case. Even the energy industry over that same period of time has at least stopped digging up coal and started digging up the ocean. And, even then they started going to renewable energy in that sense. So, what other industry other than financial services is so blindly clinging to innovation from 250 years ago, rather than evolving to what is truly needed in the industry, which is just a much better level of service.
Absolutely. I think the tradition runs so deep with particularly banks, right? And I think that's why it's so difficult for these organisations to often get over that hill because, you know, you talk about the energy industry, that's changed. That's had multiple iterations, throughout the last, generation by generation by generation until where we are today. Whereas, like you said, banks have remained largely the same for 250 years. I wanted
It's
to ask
it's
is,
it's strange that what on that most people kind of go, yeah, but it's highly regulated. Yeah, but it's a big, regulated industry, and you don't understand it because the regulator won't allow us to do it. And I'm like, to your point, oil and gas like could not be more regulated in that sense. Um, but and the government have such a massive interest in it, and the different countries have such a massive interest in it, but it is still going through such a gigantic transformation in that sense. I mean, the other industry to point out that when people kind of push back on that is like health. Actually, the pharmaceutical industry, literally innovates every day. They are bringing drugs to market to test and treat all different types of diseases, from curing, well, maybe not curing, reducing the impact of a global pandemic to treating all different forms of cancer. And they don't do it by killing 5 million people when they do it. They do it in a controlled fashion to bring these things to market. So I think a lot of those things are always, if I'm honest with you, excuses. I think to your point around, the how ingrained the, well, this is hard, or how ingrained the, but you don't get it with financial services. I think the only way to sort of walk people off that shelf is showing equally sizable, equally regulated, equally complex industries that have solved this problem a number of years before. Banking doesn't really need to be innovative; it needs to be a lot better at copying. And actually, if they could really get to grips with learning from other industries and copying quickly, the whole place would be a lot better.
Great. I mean, I've heard you talk before about the impact of the 2008 financial crisis, for instance, right? And how we've seen that really as very much a catalyst for the quote unquote innovation and disruption that we're seeing in this new generation. Do you feel, with everything that's been going on, with the pandemic, with the last few years, that we're on a similar precipice now? Obviously, the jury's still out on whether we'll see a similar economic downturn. I think we suffered the shortest recession in history back in 2020. But I mean, at least from where I sit, the patterns we're seeing are comparable in a lot of ways. So, what
Yeah,
do you think is going to
yeah.
be next?
I'd say definitely I say definitely it's created opportunity for sure. I think that the opportunity is for different people, I'd say, in this period of time than it was previously. 2008 very much was about a creation of a competition mandate, particularly within the UK, which meant actually it was pro startup and negative to incumbents, really. And actually, what we've seen in this period of time, the opportunity is predominantly being created for B2B startups through servicing corporates with those problems. Because I think to our point earlier on around, well, look, if I've suddenly enabled 10,000 people to work from home in 3 days, but everybody for the last 3 years have been telling me we can't do that ever, it's like you suddenly start realizing the inhibitor was you. It was you as an
It
organization that was
forces
stopping you
that
doing those things.
challenging of the thinking, right? It forces it
Definitely.
out of people.
Well, and so many organizations now, I think, are kind of trying as they can to maintain that momentum into, well, if it was us, then what else are we holding ourselves back from? So I think there's a lot of almost kind of realization of the truths in that sense, in terms of, I sound very Mulder from the X Files there, don't they? In terms of it's all coming off rather, they're all out to get it, us type vibe. But I think there's a lot of people who are really sort of facing into some home truths when it comes to, well, actually, it was us. It was our risk team. It was our technology. It was our risk appetite. It was, all of these things that were inhibiting us. So actually, in 2008, I think the opportunity was, beyond that with the regulatory change, it was new startups, new players, new people. I think now, I think the next decade is going to be the opportunity for scaling B2B infrastructure plays. If you look at actually what the baseline functionality, the lowest level primitives, the cloud services, the SaaS players, riding really the benefit of everything that we've emerged with, BaaS and embedded finance. I think that's where we'll see the most significant piece. And really, who is that then the threat to? Really, the threat there is not to the incumbent banks; it's to the incumbent vendors, and that's quite exciting because that when we talk about the fabric of financial services, that's really what we see coming to bear is that underlying infrastructure, that deep-seated fabric of what it means to be a financial services industry. Those things are now well and truly up for grabs. So it's exciting times, I have to say.
That's great. Yeah, I think coming out of the last 10 years, the technology advancements and the advancements in this sort of infrastructure, that ways of thinking, have really leveled the playing field, like you said, and put it all back up for grabs. Um, you know,
It has.
there's
I think the best thing is like it goes back to my point around don't innovate, copy. Like actually, I mean, our CTO who has built out Foundry, which is our kind of answer to that, which is we call it a financial services operating system. I mean, his background, he founded Nutmeg before this, and that's great, and all good things in terms of investments and whatnot. But his background's actually betting, because the betting industry is incredibly good at scalable infrastructure that actually can adapt to data in like real time, not about, yes, it'll be uploaded into the cloud in the next 14 minutes, but like, no, every millisecond, the risk profile is changing because you're allowing people to access bets on in that sense. So actually just bringing a lateral view of what is the computational requirement for managing risk at that level. Well, mortgages are pretty simple when you put it in that context, as is lending. Actually, most of those things are fixed data sets rather than changing data sets. So actually, if you start realizing that financial services really ain't that hard, then actually the people that you look up to in that instance, in order to emulate the success they've had, well, they've been doing this for ages. Cloud services. I mean, this is not it's new to financial services, but the e-commerce industry has been a million miles ahead of everybody in this sense. So, we lovingly say "steal with pride" to people, but we really do mean it. Which is, a lot of other industries have solved all of these problems and scaled infrastructure and scaled their business to a point where you can't deny that something like Amazon is now strategically important to countries. Do you know what I mean? Like, the distribution channels, the logistics setup that they've sent is super important. So you're telling me like you can't run a current account on these things now? Like, that's just crazy. So I think it's all about breaking down these things that have been the sacred cows, the things that we all know is true, but really, are they really today?
It's interesting what you say about the betting industry. I've come from a similar background myself, right? In a lot of ways, I think the key advantage, or it's certainly proving to be an advantage now that betting companies have had, is that they've been tested constantly throughout that process, right? If they're updates are not real time. You get people, court siding and putting the bets on half a second before the umpire calls it. They've had huge pressure, regulatory pressure from governments, and huge restrictions placed on them, almost like clockwork over the last 20 years. Do you think the reason financial services have perhaps struggled to get in front of things as much as they could is that until fairly recently there has been kind of this lack of competition for them, and lack of disruption and lack of problems? Has it perhaps been slightly too easy for them up to now?
I'd say the perception of competition and the reality of competition often end up being sort of two separate things to a certain degree. Because I'd say from 2010 onwards, I think there has been increasing pressure in that sense. But actually, the sort of skeptics have had different sticks to beat people with, to sort of advance their skepticism. Essentially, they were pretty skeptical about whether any new banks would get licenses, and then they did, and then they were pretty skeptical about them getting customers, and then millions of people switched to them. And now, the last kind of barren of skepticism is very much about, well, how are they making money type thing. And now we're seeing the emergence of that. We're seeing profitability in players like Starling. We've seen profitability in players like Oak North for a very long time. So I think the pushback on, really, is competition happening. I think that ship has sailed. I think the sad reality is that I think many of the big incumbent banks are sitting on current account books that look like active customers that aren't. Actually, I think they have a secondary current account with a that is used for discretionary spend, which actually leaves the worst of all things with the incumbent bank. I mean, it looks like a current account, it sort of smells like a current account, but your customer never logs in and they never use your card. Yes, they're paying their direct debits. Yes, they're getting their money paid into it initially, but all of the actual engagement is happening with a completely different brand. It's that zombie current account that nobody wants. You get none of the benefits and all of the operational costs. And I think as the reality of those things sets in more and more over the next couple of years, I think the dust will really settle with where switching and the advancements around all of those things is really settled out. But I think fintech has had a much greater impact, particularly in the UK, than just the customer numbers, because it's actually forced the big banks to really question, why have they been, similar to the pandemic, why have they been inhibited? Why can, Monzo was like 23 people when it started. Like, why could it build a whole bank and everything that went with that, but actually, like, NatWest with 100,000 people couldn't do that? Like, that's weird. Like, why is that so? What was the problem? Like, what is the inhibitor? Because clearly NatWest, or HSBC or Barclays or whoever, they've got all the money. It's not a capital problem. It's a process. It's an operation. It's a talent problem. So I think that pressure has created the right level of tension in the market, and a number of them get that, and they're changing, and that's great. It feels like the real competition is great for everybody. It means better things happen, but ultimately it means the customer is served better. And really, I think that's the purpose of the industry, right? We want great financial outcomes for customers, and actually, all of this change is bringing really a better outcome for consumers than ever before. Don't get me wrong, we've got, as we say, we've got 99% of this journey ahead of us in terms of really where we want to get to. But fundamentally, we have made an inroad into to really laying down the foundations of the magnitude of change that we really need to see.
I think when you talk about having the benefits to the consumer at the end, I think that's probably the biggest change that we've seen. Right, a lot of these companies behave much more like technology companies than they do financial services companies. I mean, like customer centric development and engineering, or at an engineering level, is not so much of a new concept, really. It's, we've had agile around for a long time now, but it's when we try to apply that to the fabric of a much larger organization that sometimes the meaning gets lost, right? Because everybody's
Yeah,
got to be aligned behind that.
I think it's having been in a big bank that tried to deploy agile, deploying agile against projects is kind of like it's like putting faster stripes on a really slow car. Do you know what I mean? It's like actually you're optimizing for the wrong thing. Like actually nobody in Jason, one of our co-founders at 11FS, founded Monzo as well. Um, really, really smart guy. But was there some like genius moment of creation that it was like this one feature solves all of these problems? Not really. Like actually, it's an exercise in what are you optimizing for. Big banks have had a tough time. Post 2008, what were they optimizing for? I mean, they were optimizing for not messing up. Really, they were optimizing for not mis-selling products. They were optimizing for not taking down all of your infrastructure like NatWest or a TSB did. They were optimizing for not being wrong, which means actually they become slow moving. It means that strategy is incredibly expensive and takes a huge amount of time, that there's a lot of PowerPoint that goes on, and actually the process sort of fails to focus on the thing that really matters, which actually is, we spend an inordinate amount of time trying to get people out of this thing, and it's like, look, the mantra is at the end of this project somebody has to care. Like, and actually if nobody cares, why are we doing this? Like, let's just not. And actually, if your delivery process knocks off all of the things that you think the customers would care about, and I use customers interchangeably with employees as well, because so many internal projects are even worse at this when it comes to removing all of the actual benefit to the business. But if your process is that bad that it does that, well, you're optimizing for the wrong thing. I think what we've seen with fintech, what we've seen with Revolut and Monzo and Starling and Chime and Varo and all the other players out there in the world, is they're optimizing for atomizing change, reducing the kind of unit economics of the pain that is brought in there, and testing and learn as fast as humanly possible. Monzo can go from a good idea to it being in the hands of a couple of million people in like 5 weeks' time, and that is a different caliber of capability at the fingertips of people. But when it comes to agile, I don't think they really talk about agile in that sense. It's actually about putting in the hands of people who they trust the decision making to move things forwards and make things happen. And actually, that has such a knock on effect, not only on your ability to actually do stuff, but in terms of actually empowering employees to feel like they can really take ownership of shaping something that will have a material impact on millions of people's lives. This is not Facebook for cats thing. This is financial services. Like this really matters to people. So if you can wake up, it goes back to that purpose point. If you can wake up every morning knowing you're going to make a difference, then inevitably you're motivated to do so.
I think we're throwing the word purpose around a lot, and I think it is so central to what we do when we try to treat strategy at any level. But if we could simplify it probably into three key facets, you have your purpose, if you like, going about defining the organization's mission, vision, outcomes. How do we get people behind that? That alignment throughout the organization. But then you've also got path, the roadmaps of how we get there, which is more how do we do it, you know, ways of working, the scope we're going to implement, governance, etc. And that's probably where the agile mentality comes into its own. I think we really try to promote something at Cedars, like the small A agile, right? Like business agility over like agile dogma. So
Sure.
it's we could almost use that word interchangeably with like learning and adaptation, right? Like to us, that's what it means, right? It's
Yeah,
it's being able to move quickly, test and measure and grow as a business. But then
definitely.
we've also got capability as well, which you mentioned too, which is that how do we ensure that once we've got all that in place, we're able to actually carry out what we said we're going to do, right? And all three of these can have great challenges, but I guess from where you're I guess from where you see, sorry, um, where are kind of most organisations in this space getting it wrong or finding it the most hard?
I mean, I think it does come back to that I say purpose because actually I think it underlines all of them really in that sense because really it's the thing that reinforces the why to everybody kind of on a daily basis really, and I don't think they I'm sort of visualizing your diagram as we're talking here, but it almost for me it's a cycle. Do you know what I mean? They are you can start at any one of those, but the others are what reinforce it in that sense. Very similarly, I often sort of say I think the way in which you get anything done is talent, culture, and purpose. And actually, which one's most important in those three? Well, it's like no, actually, that's not how it works. That's like saying a chicken madras has like 86 ingredients and it's like well you take any of them out of it it's not that anymore, it's something else. So I kind of feel like they are equally important in that sense because without the right culture then talented people don't reach their potential. Without the purpose then actually talented people don't join that organization. And actually without talent you can't really achieve anything. You can have a bunch of lovable rapscallions who believe in the thing, but if they, to your point, if you can't execute, then actually, what's the point? Like this is not a club. Like this is a company trying to achieve a thing. So I think it is difficult, but and the makeup of those things I think is, I mean that's something that I found really fascinating. If I'm honest with you, it's like while the um, while the makeup and the pillars that you just described, loosely we could say in any organization need to be present in order to mobilize change at any level of scale, really. But actually, the necessity for different parts of those measures to be present are going to be really different based on the cultural makeup of that organization. Are they very emotionally driven? Are they incredibly quant driven? Are they product people? Are they strategy people? Are they stonewalled execution people or what? And actually, that's where I found my experience in 11FS, but prior to that with Infosys and with Gartner, and like having seen something like open banking, which is a regulatory project, be tackled by 15 different organizations in sort of a few different geos. Everybody's approaching it very differently, and what it means to everybody is very different because every organization is different. It's so strange. Companies are just people, but those people manifest problems and opportunities in fundamentally different ways, and that for me is part of the job that I enjoy most, if I'm honest with you, is like kind of understanding people's, psychology as and their mental state. Have they, you know, been burned before? Are they, scorned lovers in that sense? Like, what is the material makeup of that organization? And then, really leaning into that to understand, well, if this is who you are, then actually, how do we get you from there to here?
Yeah, I think you made some really good points there. I think a lot of what we try to do and what we try to achieve with our framework speaks to a few of those, right? So we try to see the business as like a network, and it's like of various different connected paths. Okay, so the purpose, the path, the capability, the scope, everything is affects one another, right? You can't get around it. If you change the purpose, it's going to affect the route you get there. If you add a bit more resource an increment, the dates are going to come in and your forecasts are going to change. Everything's completely connected, and
Yeah,
we address that sort of differences between people by using data modeling, or what we call the live business model, to put in the heart of the organization that people can sort of clip their individual scenarios onto and use it as they will. But I think having that
nice.
sort of common source of truth that runs through the business, again, it comes back to that purpose and alignment point. You've got to make sure you're all looking at the same thing. You can all interpret it a little bit differently, but as long as
Mm,
you're looking at the same thing, you can have those conversations and you can plot where to go next. I think that's really key.
definitely. I think it's an interesting point as well. I mean, conversations and communication is such a critical part of all of those things because, um, and actually, I think authenticity, particularly in that sense, is really, really critical because, um, people kind of see the successes publicly, but actually, both, I mean, and I mean this in the sense of both us as 11FS or me and as individual or, other companies, like you kind of see public success in that sense, but actually business is predominantly getting it wrong and surviving, you know, it's about really understanding the opportunities that come around you and therefore not allowing um, issues or problems or you know someone messing up or somebody leaving an organization or whatever, like all of these things need to be ensured to not be fatal to that organization, which is predominantly the objective of any successful organization, really. It's bizarre, isn't it, where when we sort of we think about all of the constraints and processes we put around organizations, we never really sort of think about it. But it's like human nature is like, look, survive as much as we can, like that would be good, and then procreate and continue our genetic DNA to sort of continue our bloodlines, right? We're if we break it really down, we're pretty animalistic in that sense. And actually, really, all of the constraints that we put around organizations are, you know, fancy versions of that. I don't mean procreate in the screw other people over type sense. I mean it in the look. Actually, it's about really first and foremost, don't make decisions that risk your business. Secondly, it's about making sure that you are continuing to be able to expand and achieve more and more in terms of what you want to do. It's why I've never really understood businesses that get to a point where they sort of stop growing. There's many other challenger consultancies or whatever that have sort of come out the gates swinging and got to 20 people and then not scaled beyond it. And I think there must be something in their DNA or something in their makeup that meant it relied too heavily on an individual rather than, to your point, a system. If it's about an individual rather than about the company, then actually it's doomed to fail because that individual is a human being and human beings fail. Like that's what happens. Either literally in the sense of they mess up so catastrophically that they take the business down with them, or at some point they die. I mean, like, so actually, if 11FS was all about me as an individual, I'd be a pretty bad CEO for starters, but equally it would be a pretty bad business. So I think the systems point that you're making, I think is incredibly important. There's got to be a purpose that permeates throughout the DNA of the business, but that has to be something that is not delivered upon as an epitaph to the late great founder and CEO, but something that people care about enough that actually it would be something that they would continue to do without the founder's presence in that sense as well. So it's funny, isn't it? We try and be all business school about this stuff, but I really think it is a lot more simple than people really make it out to be.
Yeah, I think so too. I think there's a lot of great people in business, a lot of very smart people in business. I had a business mentor when I was first starting out, really on my entrepreneurial journey, and he was a chess grandmaster before he got into business, right? And he said uh, the business world is much more forgiving than chess. If you make the wrong move in chess, it's game over. It's an individual sport, and that's where it stops. You make a mistake, the game's over. Um, if we think of business as a system, it's much more forgiving in that sense, right? Because as long as you're not relying purely on an individual, and like I said, there's some great individuals in business, but if everything they know is kept within inside themselves, within inside their own head, and not sort of passed on to that business to absorb as a whole and build on and grow and pick up where they left off, then that's quite a frail position to be in.
Definitely.
Great. Well, unless there's anything else you'd like to cover, David, I'm slightly conscious of time, so I thank you for sitting down with me today.
No worries at all. I think we could talk about this and many other things for several more hours because I mean, there's just so much to unpack in all of those things, and the context of it in different organizations is such a intoxicatingly interesting subject matter that actually I'd more than happy to talk to you about it a lot longer. But I'm sure you've got somewhere to be as well.
Yeah, it's probably one for over a few beers in Norwich or wherever we land, but we'll save that for
Sounds
another
good.
session.
Awesome.
Would you like to let people know how they can get in touch with you, or I'd probably urge people as well to follow David's newsletter if you're not already.
Yeah, absolutely. Predominantly, I sort of lurk on LinkedIn these days. So just search for David Brear and happy to connect on anybody there. As Lewis says, there's a newsletter that I drop out every Wednesday, which I kind of double click on something I've been talking about with somebody during the week. Because actually, if I'm honest with you, I find writing easier when it's something that I'm super passionate about. And things like exactly like we've been talking about today gives me an opportunity to try and align some of my thoughts and not offend people too much with my complete lack of spelling and grammar. But do check it out.
Brilliant. Thanks very much, David. We'll catch up soon.
Thank you.